Thank you for joining us today. Our guest for today is Julius Stobbs, who's the principal and founder of Stobbs IP. In this episode, we will look at Julius Stobbs and Stobbs IP and what is Stobbs currently doing for their clients. We will explore some of the risks of blockchain domains and then potentially identify rewards that can be gained from blockchain domains. Another important topic is what should brand owners know about trademark registrations within blockchain domains and Web3 in general? Are there also licensing opportunities for brands in the blockchain Web3 sphere? And finally, we will discuss how enforcement, particularly around NFTs, has been going so far and what does the future hold.
Welcome to Cum Laude's Web3 podcast, where we explore the intersection of brands with the Metaverse, NFTs, and blockchain technologies. Join our host, Dietmar Lenden, as he speaks to brand owners, marketers, attorneys, and technology providers about the latest trends, challenges, and opportunities intellectual property owners need to know about the new world of Web 3.0.
There we go. Okay, Julius. Julius, do you want to give us a little bit of an intro to yourself and also to Stobbs as an organization to start the podcast off?
Sure, very happy to, and very happy to be involved and talking for ComLoud on your podcast. So my name's Julius Stobbs. Be careful what you wish for. I could talk for hours about myself, so huge apologies. I'm the founder of Stobbs. I set Stobbs up about coming up for 10 years ago now, and we're a specialist brands advisory firm. So the core of what we do is very much what traditional patent and trademark attorney firms do and what IP law firms do. We advise people on brands, protection of the brand of their brands, conflicts relating to them. But we've increasingly broadened out our offering to hopefully answer questions that brand owners have around their issues, and so we've now got wider investigations company around finding information, increasingly important, which we'll probably come back to on this podcast. We've got a big online brand enforcement and anti-counterfeiting and customs practice, which we found to be very useful for a lot of our brand owners. We've got a licensing practice, so not just the legal issues, but commercial exploitation. And we've got a valuation business, and also we've been creating our own systems as well. So the idea is this sort of fairly broad approach to issues that face brand owners, from a legal point of view, particularly, but not only. And that's what we've been doing. I set it up, as I say, about 10 years ago. We've grown quite a bit. There are about 15 of us when I set it up. There's about a little bit over 200 of us now. And we're delighted to be serving clients. We're based in the UK, but a lot of our clients are all over the world. And that's been my journey with Stobbs so far.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Julius. I guess the next question would be relevant to the purpose of the podcast, which is Web3. What does Stobbs currently do for their clients with regards to Web3? I know that some of the topics we're going to cover a little bit later, but what's the general things that you do for customers specifically around the Web3 environment at this present moment in time?
Yeah, well, I think Web3 is a really fascinating development, isn't it? And I think everyone, both as a consumer and as a business, is trying to work out what's going to happen next and what can we do, what can I do as a consumer, what can we do as a business, and how it interacts with ownership of IP, and what IP you need, and is something that a lot of our clients are really struggling with. I think a lot of their businesses are still trying to work out, well, how am I going to interact with Web3? Unless you're one of the kind of first movers, or you're a fashion brand or something like this, a lot of the time we're really thinking, what is it that my business should be getting out of this? So as it's an issue that overlaps so heavily with what we do, it's definitely an area we've been asked about, for a long time. And the main areas fall into a number of different categories. And we've really focused on trying to be as expert as we can in relation to Web3. And of course, as you know, Dietmar, we've partnered with Laude in this space to try and offer a kind of holistic Web3 offering. And I'll talk a little bit about how that, how that potentially works. But for us, the things that come up are, well, what do we need from an IP point of view? What does how should our business's IP portfolio be reviewed and changed based on, what's happening in Web3 and what might happen in the future? And so we'll do audits and reviews and advice relating to that, and that of course covers the domain side, blockchain domains. We're going to talk about a bit more, where we very much partner with Comloud. I know you're the experts on that side, but we'll flag the fact that that's important. We can come back to that. Very much the trademark side. What trademark rights do you have? Are they fit for purpose in relation to what you want to do in Web3, and what third parties might might try and do with your brands in Web3, and that you might want to stop? Uh, and then also the thing that comes up quite a bit is, well, what can we do when things come up, and how do we find out when things come up in a Web3 environment? So we help people with monitoring of Web3, but also then, what you might do about stopping those abuses of your rights that may happen there.
Thank you very much for that, Julius. So we'll do a little bit of crystal ball gazing at the moment, and if you can give us an idea of how you see some of the risks of blockchain domains for your clients at this present moment in time.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating area, of course, and I think the key thing is that obviously blockchain domains are absolutely essential if you're going to be able to, access or run space in any kind of metaverse or Web3 environment. So they're absolutely essential for that. I think there are probably a couple of key risk areas that, from a brand owner point of view, are worth thinking about. One is, they're whilst they're called domains and they're obviously designed to be able to navigate effectively and quickly, they're very not very like normal domain names. And of course, the key risk area there is that these spaces are unregulated, and the providers who are creating blockchain domains are unregulated. And so the ability to recover them, the ability to challenge the ownership of them in third parties is very limited. So that's one of the risks. So of course that creates some risk in engaging with that space, but actually what it really means is it's more essential to obtain the key blockchain domains that might be useful for you in running a space in the metaverse or in a Web3 environment than it would otherwise be, because of that risk associated with the lack of regulation. So I think that's very much a key. That's very much a key risk, in this. And I think probably the other area that's a big one is we're still relatively early in Web3 adoption, and blockchain domains are specific to particular blockchains and particular spaces, and so we don't quite know who will win the commercial battle. And so the likelihood is some of these spaces will become very successful and some may not. And so there's obviously
Mhm.
some risk associated with making choices around different blockchain domains to obtain, on the basis that some may or may not be useful in the future. But again, there are already some patterns developing in that space, and
Yeah,
certainly there are some parties that are already having some success. And honestly, because of the lack of regulation and because of how essential they are for operating in Web3, I think the sensible policy is to at least take a reasonable approach to obtaining blockchain domains that map with your potential brands and potential uses within Web3 and Metaverse. Does that make sense?
absolutely. It's
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That definitely makes sense. I mean, it's almost like we're going back to the good old 1990s with Web 2, and how that environment opened up where people weren't necessarily looking at trademark ownership, for example, and people were just buying names as and when they could, and um, some people did very well out of that, and some people especially within brands, for example, looked upon domains at the time as the internet. What's the internet? It's never really going to be something that's going to be relevant to me as an organization, and yeah. So I think this is an option, an opportunity to get in early enough to ensure that you're not one of those that are sitting there going, oh, I should have maybe done something. um, so I guess the follow on from that would be, do you do you see any potential rewards to blockchain domains?
Yeah, no, there are certainly some rewards, but I just want to touch on that comment as well. That actually,
Yeah,
I definitely agree that we've got that similar feeling of kind of lack of regulation, and so the sort of wild west. I think that's absolutely right. And I think there are plenty of people who are kind of looking at this and thinking this feels like a bit of a flash in the pan. Maybe this is just one of those things that comes and goes. And I think to a certain extent, we've already seen that a little bit with NFTs. NFTs were a huge thing at the beginning of last year,
absolutely.
first quarter and first half of
Yeah,
last year. With volatility in crypto and these sorts of things, actually, the amount of money being spent on those has already dropped off. But my personal view, despite being an old person who prefers old things a lot of the time, is that the metaverse and Web3 more generally is definitely here to stay. I think and so I think feeling like it's likely going to be a short-lived thing, I think is probably the wrong approach. I think bearing in mind the nature of our society now, even compared to when domains came along in the 90s, actually we're used to doing more in a virtual way, doing more on screens. The generation below me very much used to living their lives in a virtual way to a certain extent. So actually, it's not so much of a change for a lot of people as people might think. And then you couple that with the sort of entities like Meta and other very large parties who are really getting behind this, then that it feels like definitely here to stay, and it'll be very interesting to see how it develops over the coming 6 months, 12 months. It's all moving very fast, so I think it would be
yeah,
definitely
that's yeah,
be dangerous to sort of assume, "Well, I don't need to think about this at this point," if that makes sense.
correct,
Mm. In,
absolutely.
in
Yeah,
terms
I totally 100% agree.
Yeah, in terms of rewards, I think the rewards are kind of the flip side of the risks, really. I mean, the fact to a certain extent, the downside, well, one of the big things about blockchain domains is, once you register them, they're there, and they really, except in very exceptional circumstances, can't really be changed. So, you're making a relatively small investment for something that potentially provides your access to a particular Web3 or metaverse space, potentially forever. And I think they're very much the other reward is, even if you're not absolutely sure what your business is thinking about doing in Web3 or metaverse, those blockchain domains are going to be absolutely key for executing whatever it is you decide to do. And so I think the relatively simple task of obtaining them gives you that peace of mind that you may well be able to do the things that your business end up wanting to do in those spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Mhm.
100% agree. So, what do you think brand owners should know about with regards trademark registrations within blockchain domains and Web3 in general?
Yeah, I think the trademark space is an interesting one because I think businesses could be forgiven for thinking, well, I've already obtained my trademark registrations, that protects my brand. So surely,
Yeah,
surely, actually this Web3, kind of thing doesn't really change that. I think the key thing to be thinking about in that is well, one, what's the coverage of the trademark? So what have you got trademark protection for? And the other is, geography. Does Web3 change, the geography that we might need in relation to our trademark protection? So those two things, the first thing is obviously one of the key things about trademarks is it protects you. It doesn't protect your brand per se for absolutely everything that you might do. And I, and I think the thing about Web3 is the products or offerings that you might have in Web3 may well be rather different than the products that you have in a physical environment. And I think that means that the trademark protection that you have for your core products may not be suitable or sufficient to provide you the sort of comfort that you might need depending on what you might do in a metaverse. So I think that's one of the key things to be looking at. Different people are engaging with Web3 differently. So some entities are just using it as another sales channel. How can I generate more sales through people who are engaging with Metaverse for my normal products? If that's the case, then the likelihood is your existing trademark portfolio might be sufficient. But actually, a lot of others are thinking, well, what can I do differently in Web3 or Metaverse? Have I got different products, interesting digital products that I can provide? And those may well not be covered by the traditional trademark portfolio. So that's a key thing to look out for. And then your infringements in Metaverse, the key bad actors, I mean, it probably overlap the jurisdictions that you're looking at already, but there may well be some places where actually it would be key to have trademark protection from a defensive point of view, where it might not be the key places you're thinking of from a traditional physical, retail or operation point of view. So I think they're probably the big areas that you need to look at. Obviously, the detail will vary very much depending on the business.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, have you found have you found clients being interested in the idea of getting a new a new trademark registration, but that's relevant, let's say, to the metaverse, because the metaverse is a different beast in comparison to, let's say, a blockchain domain, for example, or even an NFT, because it's not geographic per se. I mean, it's everywhere. It's not singular. So, have you seen people being a little bit more interested in that type of registration?
Well, people are definitely interested. The problem is, trademark protection, isn't designed for a specific metaverse. So actually, that aspect of metaverse is similar in Web3 to Web2 in the sense that the internet also isn't jurisdictional. So actually, thinking about your trademark protection from the point of view of actually, where do I need protection, bearing in mind my online activity, that actually has some similarities with Web3. Metaverses as well aren't jurisdiction specific, but of course, the operation of
Yeah,
them, the people who sit behind them, seem to be more likely to be in certain countries than others, and so having
correct.
protection in those is probably quite useful. I think the point becomes actually, yeah, you definitely want. Well, I want to protect my marks for a particular metaverse, but actually, the legal systems that we operate in aren't yet caught up with that type of situation. So we have to make do
Yeah,
and sort of shoehorn
yeah.
the kind of traditional systems into the metaverse world.
Have you seen the regulators, for lack of a better word, for the trademark side of it? Are they becoming more engaged in the concept of Web3? So in other words, EU IPO, or the US government entity that looks after trademarks,
Mm.
are they becoming more involved in that? Are they talking to the community, or are they just kind of working in a silo isolation and just pretending that nothing's happening?
Well, that's a really good question. I wouldn't want to say they're not engaging. I mean, I haven't seen much engagement. That doesn't mean there isn't any. I think they are engaging with issues that directly relate to trademarks quite a lot. So, the offices are having to deal with trademark applications to cover Web3, Metaverse, NFT applications, which historically don't fit with the sort of traditional approach to trademark protection and classification. So we're getting quite a lot of activity around that. These offices engaging with, well, how is it? How would you go about protecting virtual goods rather than physical goods, or NFTs? These sorts of things. So I think that's really where the focus has been. I think exactly how they go about doing, so for example, wider regulation around trademarks that might apply to a particular metaverse or these sorts of things, they're beyond the scope of those offices, if that makes sense, because they're sort of geographical. So that isn't happening as much. That, of course, is one of the kind of regulation around those spaces is one of the reasons why, Com Loud and Stobbs set up our brand's metaverse group, because we do think actually, the kind of taking the views of brand owners to the people who are running these spaces in order to get some better voluntary regulation is a really key aspect that needs to happen over the next time period, as soon as possible. But the interesting thing is, we think it's really important for both for the brand owners, of course, to be able to have some peace of mind over how consumers and brands will operate in those spaces, but also the spaces themselves. I think for them to be successful, consumers and brands need to trust them. And without any kind of regulation, it's going to be very difficult, I think, for the average member of the public to sort of trust operating in that space.
Absolutely, that's a very valid point. It becomes an issue of trust at the end of the day. I know sometimes sounding like an old person now. Apologize, but the younger generation tend to be less concerned about what's happening within a particular environment, whereas the older generation are more not aware, but more scared of being involved in certain areas, and they don't want to go into a metaverse environment to purchase or to look at something or purchase something and then realize that they're actually buying it from somebody who's not who they thought it was. I know that happens on a day-to-day basis anyway. If you go to like certain resale platforms, etc., I won't mention their names, but I mean that does happen.
Yeah,
But it's a very valid point, that I think, and it's something that needs to be worked on, as you say, by the actual communities themselves. They need to appreciate that at the end of the day, if they want brands to be involved and big brands to be involved, they need to look at how their community is regulated. And self-regulation is probably one of the easier way to go, as
yeah,
opposed to being forced
yeah.
by government regulation, etc., to take an action.
Yeah, I think actually, the likelihood is, bearing in mind the nature of these spaces and the fact that actually, some of the kind of anonymity in these spaces comes about for a reason. And, people
Yeah.
don't want to be subject to heavy regulation and law and these sorts of things. I'm a lawyer, and so often I'll be thinking about legal recourses, etc. But even I don't think that really heavily imposing regulation on these sorts of things would be a successful way to go. I think collaborative approach, really actually working out what would be beneficial both for those running the spaces and for those using them, and coming to a collaborative conclusion is likely going to be a much more successful and likely be more successful in the long term than anyone thinking, even if they could, then imposing some form of formal legal regulation around it. I think you'd likely just get reaction to that. Whereas actually, I think there's some good traction to be made on sort of positive discussions as to why it's
for
beneficial for
for
both
both
sides of the
parties. Yeah,
discussion.
absolutely. Now, right at the beginning, you did mention that you also look at licensing as part of the Stobbs portfolio of services. Um, are you
Yeah,
are you seeing an increase in licensing opportunities for brands, specifically in the Web3 sphere, as we're talking about Web3? Are you seeing brands coming to you and talking to you about how do we how do we license the use of our brand within the Web3 environment?
yeah, it's definitely because of what we've already said, that Web3's a very different environment than a physical environment. It creates different potential products and different potential things that can be consumed by the consumer, and that in and of itself opens up opportunities for brand owners. I think the interesting thing about licensing, it's a very attractive way of exploiting IP and exploiting brand rights, because mostly it's sold on the basis that you can obtain some very high margin revenue without significant capital expenditure as a brand owner, or without the expertise. I think probably the latter is probably the key thing in relation to Web3. I think a lot of people are looking, well, there are opportunities, but my organization focuses on its core business. And so, how would I go about exploiting those? The big organizations will have, well, okay, this is a big enough opportunity to really get this in house. Others will think, well, actually, there are going to be people who have real expertise in this space, and we'd be better off effectively licensing our rights out for those opportunities. At the moment, those opportunities are around what about NFTs, or what about virtual products? But so that, and for certain brands, those could be huge opportunities. For others, they may be more limited, depending on the kind of brand that you're operating in. But it's definitely an area that people are asking, particularly because they don't feel like they have the expertise themselves.
And I think one of the important things for our listeners, I guess, is that this environment is changing constantly, and it's not just metaverse, Web3, NFT, metaverse, blockchain domains, and NFTs that are important. I mean, there's other things like contracts, for example. Contracts between parties can be used within the blockchain environment, and I think that's actually something that people need to keep in the back of their minds, is that it's not just limited to a couple of things. I mean, there is possible scope for massive growth within different parts of the blockchain environment as a whole, which I think is really important.
That's absolutely right. And when we talk to our clients about these sorts of projects, always the starting point is the blockchain domains.
Absolutely,
Then
yeah.
obtaining some decent trademark rights around the space makes sense. Thinking then about, well, actually, how might we go about exploiting this? We've helped people with NFT launches and Web3 launches. Of course, at the next stage, there are often some real other issues. Actually, clearance of rights, as you say, the contract issues, depending on whether you're outsourcing to a third party to help you or not. How would you frame the smart contracts around the NFTs? All of these kind of things. So there are quite a few issues which are all new
Yes.
to brand owners. But
Yeah, yeah.
starting point is definitely getting your IP house in order with the blockchain domains and the trademarks, and then you at least
Absolutely.
put yourself in a good position to consider those other issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and you also mentioned earlier your enforcement part of the business. So how are you finding the enforcement, particularly around NFTs? How's that been going so far? And do you see this as something that's going to grow? I know we mentioned that the NFT market took a little bit of a dive last year, purely because of the cryptocurrency um, taking a dive last year. But how do you see the enforcement aspect going forward?
Well, it's obviously a difficult area to enforce, particularly because of the lack of regulation, as we spoke earlier. So there's unlike the development in relation to domain names, where we've got administrative procedures, and marketplaces, we've generally got pretty straightforward takedown processes, and there are kind of cost-effective routes in. A lot of that isn't yet fully developed in the metaverse space. We also have the difficulty that increasingly, I mean, the internet, you can hide pretty well on the internet, but obviously Web3 and metaverse is more obscure from an understanding who's behind it. So for us, what we're finding is the first thing is always data and information. Data's king. We want to know as much as possible about what's out there, and what's there. So increasingly, we're monitoring what tech providers have good monitoring around, particularly NFT spaces, but also more widely metaverses. And we are seeing some pretty good products around in that space. Often, when it comes to an enforcement issue, there are a lot of enforcement issues for brands. I mean, a lot of most well-known brands will have issues in Web3 spaces. I think there's probably a process that you then go through, which is, well, first off, do I care about it?
Yes.
That may sound a bit trivial, but
Yeah, absolutely.
at the moment, I mean, like in all enforcement, you don't just go ahead and deal with it willy nilly. In metaverse spaces, particularly, well, actually, is anyone really seeing this? Am I likely to give it more fuel by going after it than
By
I will
taking
by
an
just leaving
action,
it
yeah.
alone. Exactly. I mean, suddenly I've got a public court case, and it could end up being a bigger issue than it actually is. So that's definitely something to take into account. And then the next thing is, well, what can we do to find the relevant parties? Where it's a blockchain domain or an NFT, usually, you're sending messages through wallets, or you're contacting the platform that's selling the NFT, and you're kind of that's your starting point. The next stage, if that isn't being successful, I mentioned we have an investigations company. Actually, the more forensic, almost financial investigation is the next step to actually find the party. Because ultimately, someone will have had to have paid for something somewhere, and there is usually a record of that one way or another. So that's usually the next stage. I think so. And then from there, the enforcement options will really depend on what's happening and what your rights look like. But there are always enforcement options. It's just quite difficult. It's more difficult than traditional situations. That doesn't mean it's not possible. Um, on the NFT side, and increasingly, some of the platforms are pretty amenable even to informal requests where you can be clear about what your rights are. And so again, it really, OpenSea being quite amenable to sort of take down requests on NFTs that where they don't have the rights or they're infringing other people's rights. Other spaces are being less amenable, but there's always something that can be done. The question is, in an area where it's more difficult, how much time and effort do you want to put into it, and how much is it really impacting? Probably the last thing I'd say on that is increasingly we're seeing Web3 and Web2 overlap. So, those people are thinking, well, no one's really looking at Web3. Well, some people are, but not as many. Actually,
Sure, yeah,
increasingly
yeah.
people are sort of publicizing their Web3 issues by using Web2, and that's where a really effective Web2 monitoring program can be really helpful in
Absolutely.
dealing with issues that come up in Web3. So I think, unfortunately, if Web3 and Metaverse is with us to stay, then the likelihood is, as and until we have more effective regulation, issues in relation to enforcement are going to get more prevalent rather than less. So,
Yeah, yeah,
but there are things that can be done. It's just a question of being sort of fairly strategic about that.
yeah, absolutely. So watch the space. Uh, basically. Julius, I'd like to say thank you very much for taking time to come and have a chat with us today.
No, delighted to be working with Laude in relation to our Web3 offering, and looking forward to seeing what the next 6 months, a year, 2 years holds in this space, because it's a really fascinating one.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Julius. You have a great day.
Thanks, Dietmar.
Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Big thanks to our guest for answering all our queries. If you have any additional questions or would like to have a chat with us, please send an email to web3@comlade.com and we will get in touch with you.